Have you ever lived through a time when everything seemed calm, almost perfect, until one small change turned that harmony into an unexpected challenge? Well, that's exactly how life was for Dona Camila, an elderly woman with hair as white as cotton, a face etched by time, and hands calloused from a lifetime of hard work in the fields. Dona Camila lived alone on a small farm far from town. Her constant companion was Benedito, a brown donkey with big ears and bright eyes that seemed to understand every word she said. They had a simple but purposeful routine. Camila would plant vegetables, care for the chickens, and harvest fruit, while Benedito helped carry the heavier loads to the market where she sold her goods. It was a sunny day, like any other. Dona Camila was leaning on the corral fence, watching Benedito lazily graze.
"Ah,
Benedito, you're my best company, you know that?" she said with a smile. The donkey lifted his head and let out a soft bray, as if he were answering her. But over the past few weeks, Camila had noticed something different about Benedito's behavior. He seemed more stubborn, more distracted. When she called him to help with the chores, sometimes he refused to come. This wasn't the Benedito she knew, always obedient and ready to lend a hand. That morning, as she prepared sacks of corn to take to the market, Camila realized Benedito wasn't in the corral as usual. Now where could he be? Disappearing on me at a time like this, she muttered in frustration as she searched the pasture. She found him lying under a tree, as if he didn't have a care in the world. "Come on, you lazy thing. We've got work to do," she called, but Benedito didn't budge. When she insisted, he slowly got up, but instead of following her, he turned and walked the other way. Camila felt her blood boil. "Oh, is that how it's going to be? Disobeying me now? Fine, stay there by yourself," she snapped, hands on her hips. She walked away, trying to hide her hurt. It felt like her most loyal friend was rebelling for no reason. Deep down, though, Camila also wondered if she might be being too hard on him. After all, the donkey was her only companion in such an isolated place. The day passed in silence. Camila went about her tasks alone, casting furtive glances at Benedito, who stayed off in the distance. The tension between them seemed to grow like a storm cloud, ready to burst at any moment. And so, for the first time, something began to shift in the relationship between Dona Camila and Benedito. What had once been an unshakable bond of companionship now felt threatened, bringing with it a challenge neither of them could have anticipated. The next morning began with the crowing of roosters and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. But on the small farm, the silence between Dona Camila and Benedito felt heavier than the air itself. It was a silence loaded with resentment and hurt, though neither of them could put those feelings into words. Camila rose early, as usual, and began loading the old wooden cart with the goods she'd take to market: sacks of corn, baskets of fruit, and a few fresh eggs. Benedito, however, remained in the same corner of the pasture, pretending not to notice her movements. "Aren't you going to help me today, Benedito?" Camila asked, her voice tinged with sarcasm as she adjusted her straw hat. The donkey stubbornly turned his head the other way. That was the last straw. Camila dropped the baskets and marched over to him, pointing her finger as though scolding a misbehaving child. "You think you can just do whatever you want, don't you? Well, let me remind you who's in charge here." Startled by her sharp tone, Benedito stood up suddenly, but instead of following her, he took a few steps back, braying in protest. Fueled by frustration, Camila grabbed the rope tied around his neck and tried to pull him, but the donkey resisted with all his strength. "Fine, Benedito, enough," she shouted, letting go of the rope and throwing her hands up in surrender. "If you want to be stubborn, suit yourself. I don't need you to do my work." With that, she turned back to the cart, hiding the tears welling up in her eyes. It wasn't just Benedito's defiance that hurt her, it was the feeling that, somehow, she had lost their connection. From across the field, Benedito watched Camila leave for the market alone. His sad eyes seemed to ask, "Why are we like this?" But his pride kept him rooted in place. As Camila trudged along the dirt road, pulling the heavy wooden cart by herself, the emptiness she felt weighed far more than the sacks of corn. She tried to push the thoughts away, telling herself that Benedito needed to learn a lesson. But a small voice in her heart nagged at her, "Was I too harsh?" Benedito, meanwhile, stood motionless for a long time, staring at the horizon. Something inside him told him he should follow her, but he also felt the need to prove that he was in the right. And so, he turned toward the woods instead, where the stillness of the trees became his only company. The distance between them, once purely physical, had now become emotional. The bond that had held them together was frayed by pride, and both chose their own paths, not realizing that their separation would only deepen the pain they already shared. The day felt longer than usual. The sky, once clear and sunny, was now overcast with gray clouds threatening rain. Yet, for Dona Camila, the weather hardly mattered. Her mind was elsewhere as she dragged the wooden cart along the dirt path. Each step felt heavy, as though the ground itself was trying to hold her back, forcing her to reflect on the events of that morning. Her body ached, but it wasn't just physical exhaustion that weighed on her, it was the emptiness left by Benedito's absence. "That ungrateful donkey," she muttered, more to herself than out of genuine complaint. "After everything I've done for him. No, he needed to learn." But even as she spoke those words aloud, something inside her disagreed. It was as if a part of her heart knew she might have been too harsh. After all, Benedito wasn't just a work animal. He was her friend, her companion on the quiet mornings and lonely afternoons on that isolated farm. Deep down, Camila knew she had been wrong. It wasn't just Benedito who had been stubborn, she had refused to back down too. But pride, oh, pride was a hard wall to break. When she finally arrived at the market, the scene was familiar. Colorful stalls, voices overlapping in bargaining and laughter, children running between the rows. Yet to Dona Camila, everything felt distant. She set up her stand slowly, feeling Benedito's absence like an open wound. "Well, Dona Camila, where's Benedito today?" a fellow vendor asked as he arranged his pumpkins. "Left him back at the farm," she replied, trying to sound indifferent. "He's been too lazy lately." The man chuckled, but Camila didn't find it funny. Every mention of Benedito felt like a painful reminder that something precious between them had been broken. Meanwhile, Benedito wandered through the woods, his steps slow, his head hung low. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, but the forest, once a place of peace, now felt empty. He was hungry but lacked the energy to look for food. He was cold, but the warmth he craved didn't come from the sun or a fire, it came from Camila's hands, which had so often stroked his fur as she hummed softly at the end of the day. Benedito stopped by a stream where he used to drink. His reflection in the water looked distant, as though he no longer recognized himself. Why did she yell at me? Why did she leave me? He wondered, unaware that, across the fields, Camila was asking herself the same thing. Why did I act that way? The days dragged on. Back at the farm, Camila tried to keep her routine, but everything felt out of place. The garden no longer sparkled with life, and the silence was so deep it made the birds' song seem faint. Every afternoon, she sat on the porch, gazing at the farm gate as if waiting for Benedito to appear.
Ah.
Benedito. Are you okay? She murmured as the sun dipped below the horizon. In the woods, Benedito was also learning the consequences of his choice. Food was scarce, the cold was relentless, and the loneliness only deepened with each passing night. He remembered the days when Camila would greet him after work with fresh water and a handful of corn. Now, all he had was the echo of those memories. But pride remained a barrier for them both. Camila couldn't bring herself to admit she was wrong, and Benedito, even while missing her, didn't know how to return home without it feeling like surrender. The physical distance between them was small, but the emotional gap felt like an unbridgeable chasm. Still, amid the silence and solitude, something began to shift in their hearts. Both started to realize that what hurt most wasn't the absence itself, it was the lack of forgiveness. And so, as the sky grew darker with storm clouds and the wind carried the promise of an imminent downpour, Dona Camila and Benedito faced the hardest lesson of their lives, understanding that sometimes, to regain what truly matters, you have to set aside your pride and open your heart to forgiveness. The storm arrived like an uninvited guest that night. The wind howled through the cracks in the house, making the candles on the wooden table flicker as Dona Camila tried to mend an old tablecloth. But her eyes couldn't stay focused. With every creak of the windows and each distant clap of thunder, her thoughts returned to Benedito. She had tried to ignore the feeling all day. She went about her chores as usual, watering the plants, feeding the chickens, and preparing dinner. Yet, no matter what she did, she couldn't shake the image of her donkey. She remembered him as a young foal, stumbling after her when he first arrived at the farm. Camila had cared for Benedito as if he were her own child, feeding him by hand in those early days. Now, the thought of him alone, without shelter in the rain that had begun to pour, made her chest tighten. Camila set the sewing aside. Her tired eyes, worn from the years, fixed on the window shrouded in darkness. "Is he okay, out there?" she whispered to herself, wrapping her arms around her shoulders as if to ward off the guilt that was slowly creeping in. Meanwhile, in the woods, Benedito faced the hardest night he'd known since leaving the farm. The rain came in sheets, soaking his short fur, and the cold cut through him like a blade. He tried to take shelter beneath a tree, but the relentless wind found him there, shaking the branches above his head. Sitting on the damp ground, his muzzle resting on his legs, Benedito began to recall simpler days. He pictured himself lying beneath a starry sky with Dona Camila at his side, telling him old stories while stroking his head. He remembered the scent of fresh corn she would always bring him and the soothing tone of her voice, which made him feel safe. "Why did I leave home?" he wondered, as tears mixed with the rain on his face. But the storm that troubled him most wasn't the one outside, it was the one raging inside. Benedito realized he had been stubborn. He had chosen defiance when he could have trusted the woman who had always cared for him. The night dragged on. At the farm, Dona Camila sat by the window, listening to the sound of the rain pounding on the roof. It was a sound that usually brought her peace, but tonight, it felt like a reminder of the loneliness she had helped create.
"Ah,
Benedito. Why are you so stubborn?" she said aloud, but then corrected herself in a whisper, or was I the one who was too stubborn? Camila ran a hand over her face, feeling the lines etched by time and worry. In her long life, she had learned that loneliness was a heavy burden, but she never imagined losing Benedito would leave her feeling so hollow. He wasn't just a work animal. He was family. In the stillness of the night, as tears quietly fell, Camila began to realize that maybe she had been wrong. Perhaps she shouldn't have yelled at Benedito. Maybe there had been another way to handle things. But regret is a difficult thing to accept. Admitting she had been in the wrong made her feel vulnerable, and vulnerability wasn't something Camila handled well. She stood, drew the curtains, and went to bed, but sleep eluded her. Outside, Benedito wrestled with his own feelings. He wanted to return, to feel the warmth of the farm again, but fear kept him rooted in place. He was afraid he wouldn't be welcomed back, afraid that Camila was still angry with him. That night, though they were separated by distance, they were united in their shared regret. Both began to understand a profound truth: pride builds walls, but sincere regret is the first step toward breaking them down. As the rain finally eased and the first timid stars appeared in the sky, something shifted in their hearts. Maybe it was time to set their pride aside. Maybe it was time to find their way back to one another. Dawn arrived slowly, as if the world itself hesitated to wake after such a tumultuous night. The farm was shrouded in a thin mist, and the earthy scent of rain-soaked soil lingered in the air. Dona Camila stepped onto the porch, cradling a cup of hot coffee in her hands, her gaze fixed on the horizon with a heavy heart. She hadn't slept all night, tossing and turning as thoughts of Benedito consumed her. Had he found shelter? Was he hurt, alone somewhere? Each possibility gripped her chest, nearly bringing her to tears. Yet, amidst her worry, a stronger feeling began to bloom, the yearning to see him again, no matter what. Without hesitation, Camila grabbed her old shawl and set out across the field. The ground was still damp, her boots squelching with every step. She had no clear direction, only the sound of her trembling voice calling out into the quiet morning. "Benedito! Benedito! Where are you, my dear?" Benedito, who had spent the night beneath a tree in the woods, stirred at the familiar sound. He lifted his head, his ears twitching like little antennas. Was it real? Or just his tired mind playing tricks on him? He hesitated, remaining still for a moment, until he heard it again. "Benedito! Please, come home." That voice, so familiar and full of warmth, made him stand up despite the lingering exhaustion in his legs. Benedito looked toward the farm but paused. What if she was still angry? What if she didn't want him back? The fear of rejection rooted him in place, even as his heart pulled him toward her. Meanwhile, Camila pressed on, her voice cracking with emotion. Each time she called his name, the weight of her guilt seemed to grow heavier. "I was wrong, Benedito. I was too harsh with you. Please, come back to me." And then, as she rounded a bend in the pasture, she saw him. Benedito stood just a few meters away, his coat wet and muddy, but his eyes shining with a mix of relief and apprehension. He stared at her as if trying to gauge her reaction. Camila froze, her heart pounding. For a moment, neither moved. It was as if the entire world had gone still, holding its breath to see who would take the first step. "Benedito," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. The donkey lowered his head, almost as if apologizing, and took a tentative step toward her. At that, Camila couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She dropped her shawl and ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck, not caring about the mud that stained her clothes. "My sweet boy. I've missed you so much. Forgive me, Benedito, for being so stubborn, for not listening to you." Benedito let out a gentle bray and rested his head on her shoulder, just like he used to when he was a foal. It was his way of saying he was sorry too. They stayed like that for a long while, wrapped in silence, simply taking in the warmth of each other's presence. There was no more anger, no more pride. All that remained was the love that, even through the conflict, had never wavered. Finally, Camila pulled back slightly and looked into his eyes, her own still glistening with tears but softened by a smile. "Shall we go home?" she asked gently. Benedito responded with a firm bray, as if to say yes. Side by side, they began their journey back to the farm, leaving behind the weight of their separation and carrying only the lessons it had taught them. The mist lifted as they walked, and the sun began to peek through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the fields. It was as if the world itself was celebrating their reunion, promising brighter days ahead. The sun was high in the sky by the time Dona Camila and Benedito returned to the farm. Though everything was in its usual place, the old barn, the chicken coop, the small orchard, something felt different. It was as if the home, once so empty and quiet, had regained its soul with Benedito's return. As they crossed the wooden gate, Camila glanced around and let out a deep sigh of relief. "See, Benedito? This is where it all began. And this is where we'll keep going, together." The donkey looked at her with his expressive eyes, as if he understood every word, and lowered his head in agreement. Camila smiled, but she quickly noticed how tired and frail he still seemed. Without delay, she hurried to the barn and returned with a portion of fresh corn and a bucket of clean water. "Here you go, my dear. You need to get your strength back," she said, gently stroking his neck. As Benedito ate, Camila sat beside him on an old wooden bench beneath the shade of a tree. She watched his every movement, but her thoughts wandered back to the events of the past few days. After a while, she began to speak, as if she needed to let her feelings spill out into the open. "You know, Benedito. When you left, the house felt so empty. It was like even the wind had stopped blowing around here. I thought I was right to say the things I said, but in truth, I was just scared." Benedito paused briefly, chewing slowly as though he were listening. Camila continued. "Scared of losing you. Scared of admitting I was wrong. I think sometimes pride makes us act like that, doesn't it? We think we're protecting what's important, but all we're doing is pushing away the ones we love." She paused, staring down at her aged hands resting in her lap. "I've never had many people around, Benedito. When you came into my life all those years ago, it felt like God had given me a gift. Someone to keep me company, to share the good days and the hard ones. But even after all this time, it seems I still haven't learned how to take care of that gift properly." Benedito finished eating and, as though he could sense the sorrow in her voice, stepped closer and rested his head on her shoulder. Camila closed her eyes, letting her tears fall freely. "Thank you, my friend," she whispered, stroking him gently. "Thank you for forgiving me, even when I didn't deserve it." In that moment, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was a silence filled with understanding, a wordless conversation where love and gratitude spoke louder than anything else. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with golden and orange hues, Camila realized it was time to move forward. She and Benedito couldn't erase the past, but they could take the lessons it had taught them to build a better future. "Tomorrow, we'll start fresh," she said, rising and extending her hand to Benedito. He followed her lead, as if he understood exactly what she meant. And so, the two returned home. No longer just an old woman and a donkey, they were companions who, despite their flaws and mistakes, had learned together the true value of forgiveness and unconditional love. The next day dawned crisp and fresh. The tree's leaves were still damp from the storm, and the shy sun cast its first golden rays over the farm. It was as if nature itself wanted to announce a new beginning for Dona Camila and Benedito. Camila woke up earlier than usual, feeling something in her heart that hadn't been there in a long time, an eagerness, a spark of energy. She placed the kettle on the stove to make coffee, but before she could even sit down for her first cup, she heard Benedito's familiar footsteps in the yard. He was there, standing in front of the kitchen door, his eyes bright and curious. "Ready to get to work already, my friend?" she asked with a smile that lit up her face. Benedito let out a soft bray, as if to say yes. Camila laughed, a sound she hadn't made in days, and it filled her heart with warmth. "All right, then. Today we'll do things the right way. Together." After breakfast, Camila and Benedito began preparing for the day. The sacks of corn still needed to be taken to the market, but this time, Camila was careful not to rush or demand too much. She tied the loads to the cart gently, pausing every now and then to speak to Benedito in a soft, soothing voice. "I know I was impatient yesterday, Benedito," she said. "But I'm going to try to be better from now on. I promise to listen to you too." Benedito twitched his ears as if he understood. When she gave him the signal, he started walking at a steady pace, guided by the rope she held. The dirt road seemed less daunting that day, perhaps because they were now in sync. At the market, Camila and Benedito's return was met with cheerful smiles and playful remarks.
"Ah,
Benedito's back. I knew he wouldn't stay away for long," said the pumpkin vendor, chuckling. Camila simply smiled, but deep down, she knew that what had transpired between her and Benedito was far more profound than any joke could capture. By the time they returned home in the late afternoon, the weariness of the day didn't feel so heavy. Camila noticed something had shifted in her bond with Benedito. He was no longer just a farmhand or a helper. He was a true partner, someone she could rely on not only to carry sacks of corn but to share the highs and lows of life. In the days that followed, Camila made small but meaningful changes. She began paying closer attention to Benedito's needs, noticing when he showed signs of fatigue or discomfort. In return, Benedito seemed more eager and confident, as if he now trusted that she understood him better. Little by little, the bond that had been broken between them grew stronger again, like a rope that, once repaired, becomes even sturdier with time. "You know, Benedito," she said one evening as she stroked him before bedtime, "sometimes we have to go through a storm to truly appreciate the calm that follows. I think that's what happened to us." Benedito, his eyes half closed and his head resting against her hand, seemed to silently agree. And so, the farm returned to its peaceful rhythm, but it wasn't quite the same as before. Now, both Camila and Benedito carried a valuable lesson in their hearts. They had learned that true partnership isn't about perfection, it's about patience, understanding, and, above all, love. Life on the farm had settled into a gentle rhythm, like a well-rehearsed melody. Dona Camila and Benedito were now more in sync than ever. Each morning began with a small gesture, a gentle stroke, a knowing glance, or simply the quiet companionship as the sun rose over the fields. One afternoon, while watering the flowers in her small garden by the house, Camila glanced at Benedito resting under the shade of a tree. His eyes were calm, and in that moment, she felt a deep peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. "You've taught me more than I ever could have imagined, my dear friend," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Camila knew that, though simple, Benedito had been a vessel of God's grace, bringing her a lesson that would forever change the way she saw life. She thought back to how her own stubbornness had created a chasm between them where there had once been love. Yet, it was through that distance that she had come to understand the profound value of repentance and forgiveness. That evening, as the sky turned gold and pink with the setting sun, Camila sat on her porch, reflecting on everything that had unfolded in the past days. How often, she thought, do we let pride drive us away from the ones we love the most? How many times do we judge too quickly, failing to understand the other's feelings? And worst of all, how often do we wait until we've lost something to finally recognize its worth? She looked out at Benedito, who was now strolling through the fields, his tail swishing lightly. He seemed so at ease, so at peace. Camila smiled. "We're alike, you and I," she said softly. "Stubborn, but with hearts that always find their way back." In that moment, she understood the beauty of forgiveness. Forgiveness wasn't just about accepting someone else's mistakes, it was about freeing her own heart from the weight of resentment and guilt. It was about making room for love to bloom again, stronger and purer. When night fell, Camila offered a final prayer before bed. "Thank you, Lord, for teaching me that love is always worth it. That pride can be overcome with sincere repentance, and that forgiveness is the greatest gift we can give and receive." The farm rested peacefully under the stars, which shone brightly as silent witnesses to a story of transformation. The lesson was clear: life is full of challenges, but with love and humility, any obstacle can become an opportunity for growth. This story reminds us that pride can distance us from those we hold most dear, but sincere repentance and forgiveness have the power to rebuild even the most fragile bonds. It takes courage to admit our mistakes and humility to forgive, but it is in these acts that we discover the true strength of love. And what about you? Is there someone in your life who needs your forgiveness or your words of love? Maybe today is the day to take that first step. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. And tell me, have you ever experienced something similar? I'd love to hear your story.